you examine the major religions of the world, you'll discover there's a great deal of commonality in many areas. For example, most of the religions of the world have some system of morality. This is right, this is wrong, this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. Most of the major religions of the world also have a dimension to it that ministers to other people. Like we should feed those that are hungry, give shelter to those who have no place to live, give clothes to those people who are living in rags. We could look at all kinds of things that would be similar. As a matter of fact, there are some people who could come along and say, you know, actually, I think I'll just take a little bit from each of the religions and have my own. Like I can take some of the things from the Buddhists and some from the Muslims and some from the Jewish people and some from the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's one thing that sets Christianity apart from every other religion in the world, and that's Easter. Now, give me just a few minutes to explain that. It won't take long. You see, sometimes we who are Christians speak a language that doesn't make any sense to anybody but us. What I'm saying is we have our own vocabulary. We say things and we expect everybody to understand it, and perhaps other Christians do because of the fact that we're used to the language. And yet if we're trying to explain it to people who are not familiar with our vocabulary, it may not make any sense at all. For example, you may hear Christians talk about being washed in the blood. And people listen to that and go, I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound very appealing to me. We talk about people being saved or people being lost. We talk about the resurrection, so forth and so on. Can I just succinctly tie it together to explain what that really means? You see, back in the beginning of the book that we see as our holy book, we call it the Holy Bible. As a matter of fact, the word Bible means book, so Holy Bible actually means holy book. In the beginning, when God put Adam and Eve into the garden, he gave a system of morality. He said, these are things that you should do. These are things that you should not do. Because there were just two of them, the rules were relatively simple. The shall not had to do with this. There is a tree in the center of that garden. He called it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He said, now you can eat every other fruit here in the garden as long as you wish, but you just can't eat that. Now there was a reason for that, but we won't have time to go into all of that. But he said, just don't do that. And then he gave a rule. As a matter of fact, he explained something of his own nature, but he said it so succinctly that sometimes we miss it. He indicated to them that if they ate of that fruit, they would die. Now, I'll explain very, very quickly what that means. You see, when we start talking about God and look for the attributes of God, the characteristics of God, we could talk about all kinds of things. We could talk about God being loving. We could talk about God being powerful. But if you look at the attribute of God that's talked about most often in the Bible, his attribute or characteristic that's mentioned more than any other, it is that God is holy. Well, we have to stop and define what that means. Holy means to be without sin. God is without sin. And because of that, God's nature, the fact that he is sinless, that he himself is without sin, then he does not tolerate sin. It cannot be where he is. And so he said, if you sin, if you break the rules, if you transgress, if you violate, then you will die. Now, he actually talked about in two different ways that the death would occur. One would be that they would die of physical death. You see, our understanding of that story given to us in the beginning of the Bible in the Garden of Eden, there was another tree there. That tree was called the tree of life, and it had a fruit on it that when people ate it, they didn't age. There was no sickness, there was no getting older, there was certainly no death. That fruit was there. And what he was saying in one sense was, if I ban you from this garden, if you don't have that fruit any longer, then you will age, you will die, so physically. But much more important, he was talking about something that would happen on the spiritual realm. In the spiritual realm, he was saying, you will be separated from me, because really that's what death is. You see, physical death is when my spirit separates from my body. That's what death is. Spiritual death is when I'm separated from God. And so when he said, if you do that, you'll die, it's what he meant. Your body will die, but you'll be separated from me. Well, if you remember the stories from the book of Genesis, and even people who don't know much about Christianity or Judaism would be familiar with that story. As I mentioned already, you may have seen it in movies, you may have heard it somewhere along the line, how that when they did that, when they actually ate of that fruit, God punished them. By the way, that's also common to almost every major religion in the world. There is some system of punishment for those people who do wrong. And the punishment here was relatively simple. You can't live in that garden anymore. You'll be banned from it. You cannot be there. Now, there are certain consequences from that. The garden was perfect. The world is imperfect, or at least it became imperfect. And that means that you'll now have to work like you never worked before. You'll have thorns when you try to grow your plants. You'll have weeds that'll grow. You'll have animals that heretofore have been serving you that will now try to eat you if they get the chance. And so that's all going to change. And because you can't have that fruit, as I've already said, you're going to get older, you're going to die. All those things are going to occur. And yet, even as God did that, it put him in a divine dilemma. You say, what do you mean divine dilemma? He's holy, so he can't just go, oh, you shouldn't have done that, but we'll just pretend you didn't. He can't do that because of his own holiness. He actually has to do what he said he was going to do. God cannot be a liar. If God lies, then he can't be God. And so he can't say, well, I know I said that, but let's just let it go. He has to go ahead and follow through. At the same time, he loves them. He doesn't want them to be punished any worse than what they've already brought upon themselves by being cast out of the garden. He wants them to be with him. And so the rest of the Bible is this divine dilemma being worked out. I have to punish your sin, but I want you to be with me. So he predicted right there in that garden, here's what's going to happen. The woman would have a child. Now, that was significant because what he's saying is it's going to be a virgin. It's going to be an unusual birth. Nobody else is ever going to have a baby like this. There'll be no agency of one gender and the other coming together. The woman, the virgin, is going to have a child. That child then would live, and then that child would do something that nobody else could ever accomplish, because that child, when he grew into manhood, would not sin. Therefore, he would never have to be separated from the Father because of what he did. He would be sinless. He also, by the way, was the Son of God, or God come in flesh. We call that incarnate. And so now we get to the cross, which is what this weekend is all about. So when Jesus is on the cross, it's not just that he's being crucified like a common criminal, though he was. There's something much more complicated than that going on. You probably, if you have seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion, you have seen the emphasis on the thrashing that they gave Jesus on his bloody back. I have heard people teach about that, about the whips and all that was involved in that, and the tremendous pain that must have incurred as he was beaten. And I'm sure it was painful. You may have heard, or actually seen in some movie, when they put him on the cross, and those crosses weren't smoothed out. They weren't planed. They were rough, which meant they had splinters all over them. And so sometimes people emphasize, here he is with that bloody back being put on that splintery cross, and they emphasize the tremendous pain that goes with that. You may see up there a crown of thorns. That's what the Roman soldiers put on him. So they pressed it down and cut his forehead, and all those things are true, but they missed the point. You see, we know historically that other people who followed Jesus would be crucified, that they too would be beaten, they too would be on those splintery crosses, they too would have terrible things done to them. As a matter of fact, some of them would die worse deaths physically than did Jesus himself. Yet there's a significant difference in the way they died and the way he died, because many of the Christians in the first century would go to their death singing and praising God for the opportunity to die for their Savior. Yet he, Jesus, didn't go to the cross that way at all. As a matter of fact, the story as it's told to us by Dr. Luke. The Gospel of Luke was written by a physician named Luke. So Dr. Luke tells us that just before he was to be tried and to be crucified, when he was praying to the Father, to God in heaven, he was saying, if there's any other way, please take this away from me. Don't make me do this. Yet his followers would sing and praise God for the opportunity. He's begging not to do it at all. And Dr. Luke goes so far as to tell us that in that prayer, as he was praying, Jesus sweated, as it were, blood. I asked many physicians over the years when I was younger until I found some that had actually seen it. Have you actually seen people sweat blood? Yes, I have. I've talked to physicians who've seen it. I've talked to nurses who've seen it. And I've asked them, what is that? Well, it happens when somebody is terrified, they tell me. That the fear is so intense that the blood pressure goes sky high. And the blood pressure can literally become so high that the capillaries in the forehead burst. And it looks just like the person is sweating blood. That's why I said, so when Dr. Luke tells us that Jesus sweated blood, they say we read that and know that the man was terrified. Terrified. Well, why would he be terrified when his followers would rejoice for the opportunity? You see, if it were just whips and splinters and thorns, I think we'd have to conclude that he was a coward, at least in comparison to the people that followed him. So it has to be something much beyond that. And now we can summarize what it's all about. You see, what we will be told in the New Testament is that on that cross, he was made sin for us. That's how Paul would phrase it to the Corinthians. Made sin? Because he had no sins to die for, because he had lived sinlessly, the only person who ever lived a perfect life, because he didn't have to pay for his own, and because of the fact that he was divine as well as human. He was one of us in every sense, but he was God in flesh. Again, the word incarnate. Because of that, all the sins of all humanity would be placed on him at that cross at that time. You see, the means of execution was irrelevant. They could have hung him, it would have been the same. They could have pierced him with spears, it would have been the same. The method of execution just happened to be the method of execution they used at the time. What really is important about what's happening there is that the thing impossible for humans to comprehend. Every sin of every person who would ever be forgiven was taken from that person, because you see, God is not limited by time in either direction. Would be taken from that person and put on him there at that time. And what's the penalty of sin? Death. But not just physical death, it's separation from God. So what happens to him there? It's incomprehensible. No way I can explain it, because I can't even grasp it. But somehow, in some way, he is separated from God. The Father and the Son are separated, yes. We can't explain it because we don't understand it. I do know this. It was horrific. It was terrifying. It was beyond human imagination. Because you see, separation from the Father, that kind of separation, that is what hell is. And so we can say that on the cross, Jesus was in hell. To make it clear to the whole world, the entire world went dark. Why? Because God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. When God is no longer present, there is no light. And he hung there. We say, well, he shed his blood for us. Yes, we say that. What does that mean? In the Bible, blood is synonymous with life. Blood represents life. So while we talk about blood, what we really mean is life. It means that I don't have to be separated from the Father, because he was separated from the Father in my stead. So whatever I have done, am doing, or will ever do, that's wrong. That violates the Father, is not ignored. God doesn't just pretend it didn't happen. It is punished. But all of that was punished at one time in the point of history, when it was on him. And that is what terrified him. That is what he was so afraid of. That's why he sweated blood. So that finally, when he did end that period of punishment, when he finally said, "It is finished," the earth shook. People actually, some righteous people actually took their bodies again. They came back, took their bodies out of the graves, and walked around the city of Jerusalem. The centurion was a Roman officer who was in charge of the crucifixion, because Roman soldiers actually carried it out. The centurion, when he saw the earthquake, when he watched what was happening with Jesus, when he understood all that was going on around him, actually cried out, "Surely this man is the Son of God." But all of that would be a fable. if it weren't for Easter. Because you see, a man can claim that. A man could even believe that. He could be so deluded that he would sweat the blood thinking all of that was going to happen to him. It could all just be a fantasy. And so something else was going to occur to prove absolutely to the world that it really was what Jesus said it was. He did something nobody else could do. He raised from the dead. And he was really dead. They made sure he was dead. It wasn't somebody who had just passed out. It wasn't somebody in a coma. As a matter of fact, at the very end, when they were surprised about how quickly he had died, because that kind of crucifixion typically took longer, they took one of those spears and thrust it up into his side, up next to his heart, so that the sac around the heart was actually burst, and all that liquid, all that fluid came out. They made sure this man was dead. So he raised. You see, I can take you, if I knew where it was at least, somebody can take you. Somebody can take you to the tomb of Muhammad. He's still in it. Somebody can take you to the tomb of Buddha. Actually, there are a whole lot of different Buddhas, so pick one. Whichever Buddha you pick, they can take you to the tomb of Buddha. We can't take you to the tomb of Moses because nobody knows where it is, but nobody ever claimed that he left it. He's still in it, where it is. We can look at every religion in the world and look at the prophet or the person who founded it, and we can go to every one of those tombs, and that body is still there. Then you come to Christianity, and the tomb is empty. So let me read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, just a few verses here if I may, beginning of verse 1. Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel. Gospel is kind of another church word. Let me tell you what it means. It means good news. So what he's saying is, brothers, I want to remind you of the good news I preached to you, which you received and on which you've taken your stand. By this good news, you're saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. That's what I just explained to you. That he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. By the way, just before I read the next verse, leave that there, gentlemen. Before I read the next verse, he had actually been preaching around Jerusalem that he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. He was talking about the fact that he would come back from the dead in 3 days, so that when he was on the cross and was dying, the passers-by made fun of him, saying, you said you could tear down the temple and build it back in 3 days, then get off the cross. They ridiculed him with it. They didn't understand what he was saying. He was buried and was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Next verse, please. And that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. Keep reading. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. That doesn't mean still living now, you understand. Still living when that was written. Most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, it's interesting that Paul's going to use that phrase, fallen asleep, to refer to people who are dead. It becomes significant that he uses that phrase to refer to it. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, but some have fallen asleep. The next verse says, then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Keep going. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. What Paul is saying is, I wasn't with them then. As a matter of fact, back when all that happened, Paul was their enemy. Paul would actually see Jesus much later. He'd be traveling. As a matter of fact, going to persecute more Christians when Jesus would actually show up and stop him on his road that he was traveling on and appeared to him. So Paul's saying, we have ample evidence. Ample evidence. You see, if it just appeared to 500 people at one time, we could say, mass hallucination. Somebody conned him. But it was on several different occasions to several different people that he appeared. So he had appeared to the apostles. Oh, then later he would appear to the apostles again. He appeared once to 2 different men who were traveling to the road to Emmaus. He actually showed up again when some of the apostles had gone fishing, showed himself up there again. He showed himself to women that knew him very well. As a matter of fact, the very women who had come to know his body. You see, he died on Friday afternoon. The Jewish Sabbath starts at 6 p.m. He died at 3. They didn't have time to do all the things they wanted to his body. They didn't do embalming like we do in our culture, but they would put spices and perfumes around it. Do I need to explain why? They didn't have time to do that. The women didn't on Friday afternoon because he died at 3. Sabbath starts at 6. They can't work on the Sabbath. It goes all the way to 6 p.m. on Saturday when the Sabbath ends. And so what they do is they decide to come Sunday morning. And that's when they came and found the tomb empty. You see, again and again to different people. So it wasn't just a mass hallucination. He made sure on several different occasions that people had actually seen him, that this really occurred. You might say, oh, those people just all made that up. You might think that. You might think that, except if it had been just a handful, a very small handful of people, maybe so. But that many people? No. And besides, if they just made it up, then we have this question: why would they actually die under persecution and torture, where people were trying to make them say, you didn't see him, he didn't raise, he's still dead, and we'll kill you if you don't admit that he's still dead? And rather than changing their stories, they would go to these inglorious, painful, torturous deaths. You might find 1 or 2 people who would die for a lie, but that many? It doesn't make sense. I actually heard a judge once, as a matter of fact, he's a judge here in the state of Tennessee. He was talking to some other people and he said, you know, I believe that if you presented all the evidence to me in a courtroom that we can find not just in the New Testament, but in the historical records about the resurrection of Jesus, he said, I think I could probably legally declare that he rose from the dead because there's enough evidence to indicate that. Now, I'm not a judge. I don't know if you can or not. I'm just knowing that that's what that judge said. I heard him say it myself. He said, so what's the point? Well, if he raised, then he is God. If he is God, then what he accomplished on that cross really happened, which means that we can totally be forgiven of anything through him, not by ourselves, but through him. Oh, which brings us now to another difference in Christianity and all the other religions. In Christianity, you do not do good things to make up for the bad things you've done. In Christianity, you do good things because you've already been forgiven for the bad things you've done. We don't have to earn our salvation. It comes because he did it for us. And all we have to do is say, I trust you. I'll trust my life to you. And that's all he requires. So that makes us different than all the others then. There's no penance we have to do enough of until finally we're clean. There's no let's pile up enough good works until finally it's even. It's by grace and by mercy. And so will we raise from the dead? Actually, everybody will. Everybody on the planet is going to rise from the dead. Gentlemen, let's go to verse 42. Same chapter, 1 Corinthians 15. He's talking about that new body we're all going to get. And as he talks about the body you and I are going to get come resurrection day, he says, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. That means this body, the one I'm living in, the one that will die, is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. You understand what he says about being sown in dishonor? He's referring to why we need the perfumes and the spices. You know what happens to the body once it does. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. What are you saying, Paul? We are all going to raise from the dead. Every one of us. And how do we know? Because he did. You mean even if I were to take my life, I'm not over? No. Will you die from what's called natural causes? If you're murdered, if you're killed in an accident, if you take your own life, it makes no difference how it ends. You do not cease to exist. This body does, as it is now. But come resurrection day, you will get a new body that is not perishable, that is raised in glory. You're saying, so I can live as I wish. Let's keep reading. Let's skip down to verse 51. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep. Now, do you understand why he's calling it sleep? He's calling it sleep because you do not cease to exist. We shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. In a flash. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. One more verse. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then will the saying that is written come true, death has been swallowed up in victory. So because he is the Son of God, because he did rise from the dead, then we will rise from the dead as well, come that resurrection day, whenever it's going to be. And he's saying if anybody, for the people who happen to be living when it happens, that they'll get the new body too, like that. They'll be changed instantly. In a flash, they'll have the new body as well. And you're saying, that's great news. One more point. Another commonality of the religions of the world is that almost all of them teach there will be consequences for how we live. For example, those who believe in reincarnation. If you live a mean life, if you live a selfish life, if you don't minister and help other people, then you'll come back. They believe you just keep coming back over and over again, but you may come back as a worm. So they see that as being some form of punishment. I don't know exactly what they see if you're being blessed, what you come back as. Maybe a rock star, I don't know. But there's going to be some kind of a consequence, some kind of a consequence. You say, you guys believe in the consequence as well. Think about this. If I'm going to get a body that will never die, it's either going to live with God or without him. It's either going to be in the presence of God, which we would call heaven, or it's going to be totally outside the presence of God, which we would call hell. Jesus would only be outside the presence of God for a few hours. Yeah, because he understood what that is. He was terrified. He was so terrified, he sweated blood just to think about being outside the presence of God for a few hours. Think about what it would be to be outside the presence of God forever. That's why it's called hell. Because I'm going to get a body that is imperishable. That means immortal. I will live again. And that body will never get a day older. That body will never get sick. That body will never die. And if I'm with God, that's great news. If I'm not with God, that is terrifying news. So what do? We make a decision. You mean a decision to live perfectly? Oh, I think if you make that decision, you'll be quite disappointed. Nobody's accomplished it yet except one. No, the decision has to be based on the fact that I will live again and live forever in a body. Different than this one, but a body. Do I decide to trust Jesus, surrender to him, so that when I come with the new body, I live in paradise? Or do I make a decision to live my life without Jesus? To live it my way, to trust in my own ability, to pay for my own sins. Is that what you really want to do? I mean, really? This would all be a fantasy if he didn't raise. But he did. It's real. Whether we want it to be true or not, it is. Whether we want it to happen or not, it will. So how do you choose to live? How do you choose to live? With Jesus or without? Now we're going to end our service in an unusual way today. A little different than we normally do, so just listen if you will. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to bow your heads and pray. Obviously, it's up to you as to whether you pray or not. It's your decision. We're not going to end our service the way we normally would. We would typically end with a song and maybe with another prayer and et cetera, and everybody knows when it's all over and people stand up and start greeting each other. And I'm all for people greeting each other, but we're not going to do that today, not in the normal way, not the way we usually do. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask our shepherds and our ministers and their spouses to get at every exit. I mean, just in that little hall there, out in the foyer there, somebody in this hall over here, so we can make sure that we speak to you when you leave, because we want you to know we really do appreciate you being here. We really do. And I hope you understand that nobody in this room is perfect, and none of us thinks that we are going to heaven because we're such good people. We believe we're going to heaven because we've surrendered to Jesus. But maybe you picked up on the fact that we do love to worship. Maybe you picked up on the fact that we do care about each other, even though we are imperfect. So that when, in just a minute, I ask you to bow your heads and pray, deal with God. Whenever you're done, which might be in 5 seconds, it might be in 5 minutes. It's totally up to you. It may be instantly. Whenever you're done, feel free to leave. But I ask that you don't visit in this room. Visit in the foyer. Visit out there. Visit over there. Because it's good to visit, and we want you to visit. But leave this room quiet. Because there may be some who continue to pray. Oh, and if in the process of your praying, you realize you need someone to pray with you, or somebody to listen to your hurt, or somebody who can open the Bible and teach you a lot more about Jesus than I've been able to teach you in 25 minutes here. If that happens while you're praying, come up to one of these front chairs. And there'll be a couple of us left in here. And we'll sit down with you. We'll pray with you. We'll listen to you. We'll talk with you. We'll set up Bible studies with you. We'll do whatever you want. But it's up to you. So you understand? We'll have shepherds and their spouses. So we make sure that we speak to everybody. And as you who are members, as you finish, if you want to head out and make sure you greet everybody, that's fine too. Just leave this room as a quiet place. So, pray as long as you wish. Leave whenever. If you need us to help, come up here. But here's the question. What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus? John, you and Carolyn step here with me. We'll pray. Leave when you wish. Just bow your head and pray. Leave whenever you're ready.